Greetings, fellow Grimdark enjoyers. I don't discuss the Imperial Guard all too often on the channel, but this is one of those rare cases. I was chatting with my guard buddy about the 10th edition Codex, and the usual topics of conversation arose. Which detachment is ranked most competitive? Which units are the most busted? You know, the usual 40k new Codex chatter. And it's not news that Bridgehead is the big bad boogeyman detachment for the Imperial Guard. But I have no interest in a detachment centered around an uninteractive hook. What I do care about is the Siege Regiment. And while thirsty meta-chasers would scoff at the Siege Regiment as a big stinker relative to Bridgehead, what bothers me is what the Siege Regiment could be. Thematically, it's a banger. The idea of fire support from elsewhere is very on brand for the Guard. And of the 5 detachments in the 10th edition Codex, it reads to me as the most Krieg detachment. And with this being the Krieg edition for the Imperial Guard, that further sours the Siege Regiment's lackluster standing, in my opinion. Now, the back-end tools of the Siege Regiment are fine, but its detachment rule is borked in its implementation, and its chosen design direction leaves much to be desired, as it could have been the most mechanically rich detachment in the 10th edition Imperial Guard Codex. And in this video, I'll be explaining just that. Okay, so we'll start with a review of the detachment itself, working back to front. So looking at stratagems, enhancements, then the detachment rule, and this will be sort of a review / dissection of the toolkit, because I think the context matters here. So the first stratagem we have is 1 CP, whoops, let me just zoom out here. 1 CP Trench Fighters. Let me zoom out a bit more. Okay, so it's used in the fight phase. It's essentially a fight on death stratagem, which is typically used on a 4+, on most factions, sometimes improving to a 3+, like in the case of the Slaves to Darkness Index detachment for Chaos Space Marines. You'd see that if you had the right keyword. If you were Khorne, if I recall correctly, you would be able to fight on death on a 3+ instead of a 4+, which is quite good, considered quite good as an ace to play. But here we can see if you use a stratagem on an infantry regiment model, you can add 2 to the result, so it's an effective fight on death on 2+, which is extremely good. However, it's important to remember the context here. Imperial Guard don't rank as among the most capable melee combatants in the faction roster, let's say. But it's still handy, and it's thematic, right? Like if this is our Krieg, you know, down in the trenches fighting with their shovels, the fighting on death is a pretty thematic choice. So I think it's a nice inclusion. We next have a 1 CP Callous Sacrifice over on the right here. It's a shooting phase stratagem used on a platoon unit in engagement range with 1 or more enemy units. And the effect is until the end of the phase, enemy units are not considered to be within engagement range of your unit for the purposes of selecting targets of ranged weapons. And until the end of the phase, each time an enemy model loses a wound, while your model's unit is within engagement range of your unit, you roll a d6, and on a 4+1 model from your unit is destroyed after the attacking unit has finished making its attacks. So it's while it's a thematic alternative to circumventing targeting limitations from being in engagement range. However, you would think you could just fall back, but there might be circumstances where you don't want to fall back. Maybe you're just holding on to an objective, or perhaps you are the enemy has an ability that would suffer a negative outcome if you were to fall back. Maybe you're battle shocked and there's a penalty to be incurred, those types of things. So there is utility here, and again, it is very on brand for Krieg, the idea of suffering casualties being deemed worthwhile for the cause, right? The whole martyrdom shtick. Next we have a 2 CP expensive over-the-top stratagem used in your command phase. 1 infantry officer model from your army is the target, and until the end of the phase, when your model issues the move order, it can issue that order to any number of eligible friendly infantry regiment units, regardless of the range. So that's a pretty potent restriction. However, 2 CP is very expensive, and let's just look up the context here for move, move, move. We can assume pretty safely that it affects movement, which is going to be strong. Let's see here. Alright guys, just had to open up my favorite website, the Warhammer 40k. And we can see here infantry regiment units are... Well, this is actually super handy because you can just pull up a little pop-up tooltip here of all the units that would be affected under those keywords. But move, move, move simply adds 3 inches to the range of models in that unit. That is excellent. It can make charges, if you should need to charge, easier on all of these units. It can get you to places that you otherwise could not be. And it doesn't cost you in advance, so you're still able to shoot freely, because it is just a 3-inch increase to the move characteristic, which is solid. Super, super good. Okay, let's just tab it back over. So, yeah, great stratagem. It's very expensive at 2 CP, but probably worthwhile if you can issue it to any number of units. Furious Fusillade is a 1 CP stratagem in your shooting phase for 1 platoon unit from your army that has not been selected to shoot this phase. Until the end of the phase, add 1 to the attack's characteristic of ranged weapons equipped by models in your unit. +1 attack for shooting sounds amazing, right? On paper, you think of your typical Space Marine units. You're like, holy crap, +1 attack on Hellblasters, +1 attack on anything. I mean, you kind of see that fairly often with regards to melee stratagems for melee combat, but for shooting, it's a pretty unique combat or shooting, offensive shooting booster here. However, what matters is the platoon keyword, and you can see the platoon units are actually fairly limited. You have your various command squads of the different regiment types, and then you have your battle line versions of those squads. So they're not the spiciest units to be using the stratagem on. So I don't rate it super highly, but look, it's fine. And if there's a circumstance where, you know, it proves useful, you can spend the CP. Otherwise, don't, and spend the CP on something more useful like grenades or re-rolling a charge roll or something. We have 1 CP Flare Burst used in the shooting phase. 1 Astra Militarum character unit is the target. And it gives you until the end of the phase each time that unit. So it's not... Despite what you think would happen with the Flare Burst, and everyone would be able to mark out this target, it actually only affects that character's unit. But you do get a reroll to the hit roll, which is pretty good. Rerolling hits, you can put that on your tank commanders, right? That's a move. Yeah, look at all this. Look at all these character options. There's some spicy guard characters after all. Rogal Dorn tank commander, yep, it's right there. And then you have all your named characters as well, command squads. I think this is pretty good, even though it's narratively rather awkward because of the whole flare only illuminating something to the individual who threw it. Maybe that's that grimdark tech for you. And, well, actually, I don't even need to tab over. We have Minefield. 1 CP used in the enemy charge phase. It's your reactive stratagem for the detachment. And again, it's targeting a platoon unit, which does limit its efficacy quite a bit. Right? Until the end of the phase, each time an enemy unit ends a charge move within engagement range of your unit, roll 1d6 for each model in the unit, and for each 5+, that enemy unit suffers 1 mortal wound to a maximum of 6 mortal wounds. Like, this reads to me initially as oh wow, very spicy, a mortal wound output. A tool which serves as a mortal wound output, like grenades or tank shock, right? You would see this in the Grotmus Khorne detachment, where they essentially get a shooting attack by throwing a flaming skull to deal some mortal wounds. But it's actually not that good, because first of all, it only works against platoon units. And you're rolling 1d6 for each model in the unit, right? So if you're getting charged by 1 Rhino, you're rolling 1d6, right? If you're getting charged by 5 Marines, you roll 5d6. on a 5+, which is better, right? But then you compare that to something like Tank Shock, and then it's not as good. Although I will say that it is worth keeping in mind the context here. This is a reactive stratagem, so there might be some utility. And the important distinction here for Minefield is that it can affect multiple units, right? So if your opponent is looking to get lots of bodies onto an objective, and you have a platoon unit in front, you can potentially meter out some of their wounds, some of their OC on the charge, which isn't terrible. However, they have to end the charge move successfully, so you could spend it and nothing happens, which I don't like. It's a little weird, but again, it's okay. Like, you know, maybe that's just the gambit you have to kind of make with the CP you spend, and I can swallow a little bit more of that unreliability here. It's not terrible, let's say. But yeah, those are the stratagem tools. Like, I don't hate the list. I think it's fine. But we can move over to enhancements. And yeah, we'll just go right here. So we have, well, whoopsies. Should have probably muted my cellular device. Anyways, we have Eager Advance, which gives you a 6-inch. It gives the officer's unit he leads the Scout 6 ability. Very good enhancement. Getting scouts on a unit is always useful. Always useful. Flash grenades, an infantry officer model again. Enemy units cannot fire Overwatch at the bearer's unit. Also very good. You know, Overwatch, you got to keep in mind, it's not just for fighting. You often get Overwatched in the movement phase these days, and you can imagine a unit of Kasserkin dropping in, or Scions maybe, led by an officer. And being able to deny them from being blasted before they get to do their thing there's great utility there for sure. 100%. That's awesome. Bunch of cool dudes dropping in. You have Legacy Sidearm here, again for an officer. Add 2 to the attacks characteristic of the bearer's pistols. Super boring enhancement. Look, 2 extra shots on a pistol might be... It's cute, okay? We'll call it what it is. It's not terrible. You have a plasma pistol. You have a pretty decent pistol. You get 2 extra attacks, so it is not insignificant, but the effective range... Look, if your officers are in melee combat, they're probably not where you want them to be. But, look, maybe that's better than not having it, right? Definitely a more flavorful choice, I think. Feels like filler, not crucial. And you have Stalwart's Honor here as our last enhancement. And while the bearer is leading a unit, when that unit is issued an order, it also gains Take Cover, Take Cover, let's go to the superior way to look at rules. Take Cover gives you... Improve the save characteristic of models in the bearer's unit by 1. Quite good. Quite good. You get a free perk when you otherwise wouldn't, and it improves your save. Improves your save to a Space Marine standard, which isn't bad. Okay, this brings us to the detachment itself. And the detachment rule is where things fall apart for me. Let's review. At the start of the battle round, you select one of the following types of artillery support, though we're gonna go bottom up because that makes more sense. Incendiary bombardment and smoke shells work well enough. You select a number of units, which is based on the battle size, and those units gain the effects of the chosen artillery support. Incendiary denies cover benefits, and smoke gives your units stealth. Where things get weird is with Creeping Barrage. Rather than choosing units, you roll for each enemy unit more than 12 inches away from every model in your army, and on a 5+, that unit is shaken, which means it must subtract 2 from its movement and from its advance and charge rolls. Now, for clarity, this perk is good. A movement debuff is mechanically going to be strong. But good God, the fact that you can't choose what units are affected renders it ineffectual. You don't just go and make it random, because now it's completely borked. It's like, hey everybody, check out this gun. It's a very lethal weapon. But how can we dial back its potency? I know. Let's just make it so it randomly doesn't shoot.
My goodness, what an idea.
Why didn't I think of that?
It's the same design problem present in the Tyranids Shadow in the Warp Army rule. But actually, it gets worse, because Creeping Barrage has been fact to limit the number of units which can be shaken, using the same values as the other two artillery support options. So now your ability, which is random, will only affect 3 units in a 2,000 point game if you choose to use it in that battle round. It's another case of, forgive them Emperor, they know not what they do. Now I will acknowledge that this update that we're speaking to here does rein in how game-breaking the bombardment would be if you just rolled 5s across the board. As unlikely as that may be, it's possible, and so it's actually good that it's accounted for. But the design criticism stands here, guys. Nobody desires a tool that works randomly. And while fight on death stratagems may seem like a counterpoint to this, it's not. Fighting on death is giving you something you wouldn't otherwise be able to do at the cost of command points. And you are choosing what unit to use it on, gaining the benefits on a per model basis, so the randomness of those dice can be better metered out. And if you choose to use a fight on death stratagem on a unit of 1 model, that was your gamble to make. Whereas with Creeping Barrage here, this is part of your detachment system. And on top of that, we can also consider the general design direction here. At the start of the round, pick an option. Then pick a number of targets for that option. Those units suffer the effect of that option. Unless, of course, you pick the bungled Creeping Barrage option, where you choose the priority units you want to affect and hope you roll 5s, which failing that, you continue to roll for other units until you reach the number of targets that are eligible. It's just so mechanically uninspired, so boring. We can give it a boring alert.
It's boring. Boring. I'm giving you a boring alert.
And surprise, surprise, it just happens to be the case I have an alternative, which I think is much more interesting. So we're going to reimagine the army rule to create a mechanically richer interpretation of this same theme. More or less, we get similarly flavored results, with a few minor trade-offs, but I think you'll agree, the mechanical and thematic win here is worth it. Now this does require a bit of contextual framing verbiage to allow the system to operate as designed. So let's just start from scratch and build back up. We changed the army rule to sustained bombardments. At the start of the battle round, select one of the following types of artillery support below and place a 40mm bombardment marker anywhere on the battlefield surface. That bombardment marker remains in that position until the end of the battle round. A bombardment marker's area of effect is measured 3 inches horizontally from it. This is referred to as that bombardment marker's zone. Note, for purposes of models interacting with the bombardment markers, it should be treated in the same manner as objective markers. And the artillery supports here include incendiary shells and smoke shells. But before moving on, let's just review what we have here. Yes, the big pitch for the change, the hook for this detachment system, is the placement of a 40mm bombardment marker that applies the artillery effects to units within 3 inches of the marker, resulting in now a system that rather than selecting a number of units anywhere, you place a marker which could affect as many units as your selected position implicates. This is a far more interactive alternative to the published Siege Regiment detachments rule, as when playing against this detachment hook, your opponent will be keen to not group up their units tightly, which nicely evokes the blast templates of editions past. And I think on the whole, the greater the change in gameplay, or change in how an army is engaged with because of the mechanics offered in a particular detachment, can serve as a good broad metric for detachment design evaluation. As if we're trading narrative subfaction flexing for Arcadia, Krieg, Talarn, Catachan, and their contemporaries for shared detachments, they should at least offer substantively different gameplay experiences. But I digress. As for Creeping Barrage, I've actually dialed back the units it can affect. Yes, under this paradigm you only have 1 marker versus 3 random enemy units. But the fact is, the certainty of placing it to affect what you want makes it more reliable and therefore more powerful. There is also the fact it can affect as many units as are in its range, and the fact that a 3-inch radius keyed off of a 40mm marker could easily shut down a whole laneway. It's just simply a lot of facts, and so I felt it was reasonable to restrict out vehicles and monsters, as that is often a dividing line of unit types for various abilities. I also considered ignoring flying units instead. Actually, between those two, or if you have other alternatives, I'm all ears for suggestions to meter back the potency. Though suggestions for rolling randomly on units for a 5+ will be frowned upon. For the most part, that's all there is to the detachment system. Regarding the back-end tools, as I mentioned earlier, they're not necessarily problematic in the Siege Regiment as published, but I am a big fan of detachments where the back-end tools interact with the detachment system, which I suppose is another aspect of failure of the published detachment. So I have two suggestions for change. Ones which I am aware could be omitted in order to dial back the potency of this sustained bombardment detachment rule, but honestly, I prefer to bias interesting gameplay. The first is an enhancement, replacing the rather meh Legacy Sidearm. Ordnance Officer gives an infantry officer a once per battle round ability, so long as they are not battle shocked or in combat, to reduce the cost of the suggested stratagem, Priority Ordnance, by 1. That suggested stratagem, well, needs a spot, and you can only have 6 stratagems, so I've chosen to replace Minefield with the custom stratagem Priority Ordnance. Used at the start of any phase, it allows you to call down a bombardment marker within 12 inches of an officer model from your army, which lasts for the duration of the phase, which I think gives the detachment system a good bit of dynamicism. Are you about to suffer an enemy charge? Well, you could call down a tremor shell. Did the enemy deep strike where you didn't expect and they want to blast you away? Maybe you want a smokescreen. Regarding the utility loss of the Minefield stratagem, I figured that functionality could be rolled into a shell type for the sustained bombardment rule, which essentially works in the same capacity as the stratagem, but now, rather than keying off of completing a charge, it simply works off of the bombardment marker's zone. And there we have it, my take on what I would have preferred for the Siege Regiment. Personally, I think it's mechanically richer, and overall offers more consistent efficacy. But most importantly, it would probably be more fun to play with and play against. But tell me, what would you like from the Imperial Guard's Siege Regiment detachment? Well, that's a wrap on this one. If you enjoyed this video, there are buttons for liking, sharing, and subscribing. And special thanks to Julius Maximus, as well as my other generous patrons and channel members. Channel members and patrons get early access to videos, as well as free access to these shrine markers and various other STL doodads. Just a little something for those who help keep the dream alive. Anyways, thanks again for watching, and I'll catch ya in the next one.